Have you ever noticed that we are absolutely obsessed with knowing what's going to happen next? I mean, we desperately want to forecast the weather, time the stock market, predict the fate of our nations, and figure out our own personal destinies. But how do we actually do it? And more importantly, at what point does our ability to predict reality just completely break down? Think about it. From the literal neurons firing in your brain right this second, all the way up to the eventual collapse of massive modern empires, is the future already written in the data? In today's explainer, we're going to climb what I like to call the prediction ladder. We'll start with the biological machinery inside your head, scale up to some pretty wild experiments on human precognition, and finally look at the actual mathematical frameworks scientists use to predict the rise and fall of whole civilizations. Let's dive in.
Part 1. The brain's prediction machine.
So let's start at the absolute bottom of the ladder, the microscale, where prediction is actually a deeply embedded biological mechanism. It's fascinating to see how our understanding of perception has evolved over time. Back in the 1860s, Hermann von Helmholtz realized our senses give us raw, messy data, like literally a flat, inverted image on the back of the retina. He proposed that we use unconscious inference to build a 3D world out of that mess. Fast forward to 1999, researchers successfully built computational models for this process. And by the 2000s, Carl Friston formalized it mathematically with his free energy principle. The scientific consensus today? Your brain doesn't just passively stream reality, it actively anticipates it. This gives us a crucial micro-scale heuristic. Your brain is a prediction error minimizing engine. Essentially, what we consider healthy perception is, in reality, a highly controlled hallucination. You are constantly generating a best guess of what the world looks like, and you only update that guess when your senses send back a prediction error, basically when reality proves you wrong. So at this biological level, we aren't just reacting to the present, we are highly sophisticated prediction machines living a fraction of a second in the future.
Part 2. Testing anomalous precognition Tindar.
Okay, so if our brains are wired to constantly predict the immediate future, what happens when we scale that concept up? Can humans anticipate completely random events? Back in 2011, a psychologist named Daryl Bem published a highly controversial paper claiming to find experimental evidence for retrocausation. He argued people were reacting to stimuli that hadn't even happened yet, like participants seemed to anticipate the location of hidden images before a computer's random number generator even decided where to put them. And amazingly, this work surprisingly passed rigorous academic open peer review, which, as you can imagine, set off an absolute firestorm in the psychology community.
So, what did the actual data show? Bem reported a mean effect size of 0.22 across his time-reversed psychological experiments. Now, to put that in perspective, in social psychology, 0.22 is considered a small but statistically significant effect. It didn't mean his participants had conscious, superhero-level foresight. Instead, it hinted at this subtle, underlying, unconscious influence. But the big question was it real? This brings us to a massive tension when analyzing empirical data. A massive meta-analysis of 90 experiments actually held on to that 0.22 effect size, yielding an overall effect greater than 6 sigma. The math literally suggested you would need 544 hidden, failed studies stuffed in a drawer somewhere to completely invalidate the result. But the scientific backlash was absolutely fierce. Critics published complete failures to replicate the results, like the GALAX study, and they argued the data heavily suffered from p-hacking. Basically, they accused the researchers of selection bias, selectively publishing only the positive results and manipulating statistical factors to artificially inflate the math.
Part 3. Asimov's Dream of Psychohistory.
Let's step completely away from the individual mind and scale all the way up to massive populations. Is it possible to accurately predict the trajectory of an entire society? The term psychohistory has this really fascinating dual identity. Sci-fi author Isaac Asimov actually coined it back in 1942, imagining this perfect mathematical science that could predict the collapse of a galactic empire by treating billions of humans like predictable particles in a gas. But surprisingly, psychohistory is also an actual real-world academic field. It attempts to combine psychology, history, and psychoanalysis to map out the emotional origins of human behavior over centuries. Before we get into the real-world science, though, Asimov gave us an incredibly powerful conceptual framework, the mule metaphor. In his fiction, a flawless mathematical prediction of the future is completely derailed by a single, unpredictable mutant known as the mule. And this represents a fundamental heuristic in all prediction science. Macro-level predictions inevitably collapse whenever a complex, noisy outlier, think a disruptive new technology, a sudden global pandemic, or a radical leader enters the system. It breaks the math.
Part 4. Psychoanalysis and Historical Trauma.
So, how did scholars try to make real-world psychohistory work? Well, a prominent researcher named Lloyd Dumas formulated a conceptual framework called psychogenic modes. He argued that historical change isn't actually driven by economics or geography, but by how societies raise their children. Following this evolution, he charted 6 sequential historical modes, starting with brutal infanticidal practices in antiquity and progressing all the way to modern helping modes. The core theory here is that collective childhood trauma deeply and inevitably shapes adult politics. But there are some massive hurdles here. Critics harshly dismiss Dumas's version of psychohistory as pseudoscientific. And you can probably guess why. You are retrospectively applying psychoanalysis to deceased people. You can't exactly put a 16th century king on a therapist's couch to verify his childhood trauma, right? Because this field relies heavily on Freudian theory rather than hard, falsifiable historical evidence, it ultimately fails the evidentiary standards of modern historical scholarship.
Part 5. Cliodynamics and Societal Cycles.
So if psychoanalyzing dead kings doesn't work for predicting macro trends, what about applying hard data and mathematics? Enter cliodynamics. Championed by researchers like Peter Turchin, this is perhaps the closest modern equivalent we have to Asimov's sci-fi dream. It treats history as a strict, quantifiable analytical science. By integrating cultural evolution with massive macro-sociological databases, cliodynamicists search for the mathematical mechanisms that explain exactly why empires rise, fall, and cycle through predictable periods of instability. The methodology here is explicitly designed to strip away human bias. It works like this. Step 1, you take a verbal historical theory, like, say, the 200 different explanations for the fall of the Roman Empire, and you translate it into a strict mathematical model. Step 2, you derive precise, quantifiable predictions from that math. And finally, step 3, you test those predictions rigorously against massive empirical datasets, like the Sachat Global History Databank, to see if the math actually holds up to the historical record. And what does this data actually reveal? Well, applying these analytical tools to the United States, Turchin identified exactly 40 distinct social indicators that all experienced synchronized turning points back in the 1970s. Because these specific indicators historically serve as leading signals of political turmoil, his mathematical model famously predicted that extreme social instability would peak in the 2020s. Think about that for a second. A purely mathematical model built on historical data successfully predicted the exact decade of instability we are living in right now. Part 6. The Limits of Foresight. So we've scaled from the brain's error-minimizing engine all the way to the mathematical modeling of empires. But here is where we hit the absolute ceiling of prediction science. Classical statistics, which most of our forecasting relies on, assumes a closed system with stable averages. It treats any deviation as a simple error. But human societies are complex adaptive systems. They are non-stationary, meaning the baseline rules are constantly changing. In a complex system with millions of actors co-evolving with their environment, deviations and noise aren't errors at all. They are the very drivers of adaptation. There's this brilliant synthesis from the Asimov community that puts it perfectly. True psychohistory would need to model noise as information. Treat instability as the norm, not the exception. Disruptions, technological breakthroughs, radical leaders, they aren't anomalies. They are structural features of how human societies evolve. That unpredictable mule from Asimov's fiction, it's a constant, ambient noise in the real-world data, mathematically bounding our ability to ever see perfectly into the long-term future. Which brings us to our final, ultimate paradox. Human societies are uniquely self-referential. If a predictive model successfully forecasts a market crash or a political revolution, and the population becomes aware of that prediction, they will naturally change their behavior. The very act of predicting the future alters the future. So even if we eventually build the perfect, data-driven, algorithmic crystal ball, does knowing the plan automatically rewrite it? I will leave you to think about that one. Thanks for exploring the data with me today, and I'll see you in the next explainer.